Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. Look, I promise you I don't spend my days thinking, what can I possibly say online to get Reform Party politicians to try and sue me again? But if it's true, I have to say it, and the Reform Party is a terrorist organization. You just can't get round that simple fact at this point, because there are three main types of terrorism that the UK has faced in the last 50 years. One is Islamist, one is white nationalist, and the other one is the Northern Irish stuff you see around Christianity. I'm talking about the violence over the Troubles in Northern Ireland that cost 3,600 deaths. And this week, the Reform Party has managed to effectively support all three kinds of terrorism that the UK has faced in the last half century. Let's start with the Christian terrorism in Northern Ireland.
To make Operation Restoring Justice actually work, we have to leave the ECHR. We have to repeal the Human Rights Act.
Okay, so in order to do his whole deport all refugees thing, he wants to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. But the European Convention on Human Rights is a fundamental part of the Good Friday Agreement, which is the peace treaty that more or less ended the violence between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland after 3,600 deaths. But if leaving the ECHR is necessary to make your whole deport all refugees thing actually work, that means you'll have to do it immediately, which means that any solutions that you have to the problems that will cause for the peace process in Northern Ireland would also have to come immediately. Will they?
Can we renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement to get the ECHR out of it? Yes. Is that something that can happen very, very quickly? No, it'll take longer.
So you're going to leave the ECHR, therefore knowingly destabilising the Good Friday Agreement upon which peace in Northern Ireland is based for an unspecified period of time? And bear in mind, Nigel Farage has already undermined peace in Northern Ireland via Brexit. There have literally been terrorist attacks in Northern Ireland because the Brexit deal leaves Northern Ireland in a different legal position to the rest of the UK. And Nigel Farage tries to deny responsibility for that.
Previous governments have placed Northern Ireland, I'm afraid, in a different position to the rest of the United Kingdom, something that we vigorously opposed.
Mate, you stood down hundreds of Reform Party candidates specifically in order to help the Conservatives deliver this version of Brexit. So you are responsible for undermining the peace process in Northern Ireland and the resulting terrorism that followed, and now you're trying to make even more terrorism possible by undermining the Good Friday Agreement again. And as for white nationalist terrorism, obviously he's still backing Lucy Connolly, who pled guilty to inciting racial hatred after calling for refugees to be burned alive just before the riots began, which was the most widespread crisis of terrorism the UK has faced in years. Okay, so far we've got facilitating Christian terrorism in Northern Ireland, backing white nationalist terrorism in England, and as for Islamist terrorists, let's hand it to Deputy Leader of the Reform Party, Richard Tice.
Somebody could have arrived here illegally, even though they are genuinely being oppressed, maltreated or tortured by the Taliban in Afghanistan, say, and you would send them back there. What, for public lashings?
Sometimes you have to do business with people that you may not like. That's just a hard fact of leadership.
The Reform Party just said they are willing to do a deal with the Taliban that involves handing them thousands of women for them to abuse. So just this week, the Reform Party has managed to aid and abet Islamist terrorists, Northern Irish Christian terrorists, and white nationalist terrorists, but they will tell you that they're a party of national security. But I also want to look at his plans to leave the European Convention on Human Rights and therefore scrap the UK's Human Rights Act and replace it with the British Bill of Rights. Because listen to what he says when a right-wing journalist says that that's not even going far enough.
Would it not be preferable instead to simply repeal the 1998 Human Rights Act, leave the ECHR and go back to the old system of legal governance?
You know, our tradition has always been that we're free-born people, that everything is allowed, unless there is a law that specifically prohibits us from doing something, as opposed to the more European system of state-given human rights, which incidentally they can withdraw pretty much at a moment's notice.
Let me explain why what you just heard should terrify you, because the European Convention on Human Rights came out in the 1950s. It was basically a response to the events of the 1930s and 40s in Germany, based on the principle that there should be limits on what countries, governments are allowed to do to their people, and that therefore there needed to be rules at the international level to prevent national governments from doing horrendous things. Because if a government wants to do horrendous things, they can just change the laws, and so you have to have rules at the international level. And Nigel Farage, while announcing his plans to leave the European Convention on Human Rights and therefore get rid of those international protections, talked about the fact that state-given rights can be removed at a moment's notice and laughed about it. He is announcing plans to remove your international human rights protections and replace them with a British Bill of Rights, and is now laughing about the fact that even those rights, he could get rid of them at a moment's notice. He is laughing at the fundamental safeguards that were put in place after the Holocaust. And of course, no Nigel Farage speech could be complete without him admitting that he's racist. So here's what he says about asylum seekers.
The President of the European Commission announced that the EU would put in place a common refugee and asylum policy for the European Union.
Now, the UK wasn't part of the EU's common asylum policy in 2016, so we were under no obligation to take in any refugees from EU countries, which is why the Breaking Point poster was always racist, because those people simply couldn't come here. Nigel Farage was just using brown faces to scare people. And I've made that point many times, and Farage has probably gotten wind of that, and so he tried to clarify things a bit, but it doesn't make it better.
One of the reasons for Brexit was to get ourselves away from that necessary obligation, in that a few years in a European country, they become European citizens, they could come to Britain.
Okay, but the main country that was taking in those asylum seekers was Germany, and it takes at least 7 years before you can even apply for German citizenship, at which point you'd have to pass that test, so you'd be speaking fluent German, integrated into German society. You would be, for all intents and purposes, German. So the only thing that would make you different, and therefore justify that poster, would be your ethnic origin. So congratulations to the Reform Party this week for managing to show everybody that they are a racist terrorist organization. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.